Are the artifacts in museums folklore? Or is it the tales our grandparents told us? Stories we in turn will pass down. Can traditions like Santa Claus, Easter fires, Krampus or creation folk dances be considered folklore? Well, folklore encompasses the expressive culture of a group. It spans oral traditions. These are the myths, legends, folktales, proverbs, riddles, poems and jokes. Material culture, which is traditional architecture, folk art, crafts and handmade objects. And lastly, customary law, which are the folk beliefs, religious customs, holiday celebrations, weddings and folk dances. Folklore is typically passed down informally through oral storytelling, demonstration or participation, rather than structured instruction. The term folklore, a combination of folk and law, was first coined by English scholar William Thoms in 1846, replacing earlier terms like popular antiquities. At the time, folk referred to rural, often illiterate peasants, while law, from Old English le, meaning knowledge, signified tradition passed down orally. Tom's call to document folklore resonated across Europe, aligning with scholars like the Brothers Grimm in Germany, and collectors such as Thomas Crofton Croker in Ireland and Elias Lönnrot in Finland. Though best known for their fairy tales, the Grimm brothers were primarily folklore scholars, who meticulously collected and adapted oral traditions. This academic focus led to the founding of the British Folklore Society in 1878 and the American Folklore Society in 1888. Early scholars viewed folklore as a relic of the past, comparing an industrialized present with a past marked by superstition. Researchers classified oral traditions as natural scientists categorized specimens. A landmark in folklore studies was the Arne-Thompson classification system, which remains a standard for categorizing European folk tales. As the field expanded, scholars recognized cross-cultural similarities, leading to divergent approaches between European and American folklorists. European scholars focused on pre-literate traditions, while American folklorists, influenced by Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict, broadened their scope to include diverse cultural groups like African Americans, Acadians, Cayunes, and Native Americans. One of the most influential figures in folklore studies was Soviet scholar Vladimir Porab, who analyzed the structure of Russian folk tales. His morphological approach laid the foundation for structuralist analysis in literary studies. During the 19th century, industrialization and urbanization raised concerns about the loss of oral traditions, often viewed as remnants of pre-Christian mythologies. As nationalist movements gained momentum, folklore became tied to ethnic identity, with folk heroes and myths reinforcing national pride. However, the study of folklore also had darker implications. By the early 20th century, German Volkskunde, folklore studies, was co-opted by nationalist ideology, with Nazi rhetoric using folklore to promote racial purity. This period highlighted the power of folklore, not just as cultural heritage, but as a tool for shaping social and political ideologies. Folklore scholar Adrian de Groot observed that the 19th century revival of interest in pre-Christian myths enriched folklore studies. Germanist scholars sought not only to collect myths, but to identify Germanic motifs and connect them to mythology, an effort that shaped German national identity, linking it to the veneration of pagan figures like Odin. After World War II, scholars debated whether folklore belonged to literature or ethnology, leading to new theoretical approaches. Structuralism examined underlying patterns, functionalism analyzed its cultural roles, and psychoanalytical interpretation explored its subconscious dimensions. One of the most influential folklorists of the 20th century was Alan Dundes. He argued that folklore was not a collection of dead artifacts, but a living, dynamic cultural process. He criticized antiquarian approaches that treated folklore as static relics, likening them to butterfly collecting. Dundes also questioned the impulse to capture lore before it disappears, suggesting this tendency reflects folklorists' own anxieties about loss and decline. For Dundes, folklore was autobiographical ethnography, a society's narrative about itself. Dundes distinguished between folk, any group sharing a common factor, this can be nationality or religion or occupation, and law, the shared texts, artifacts and expressive traditions of that group. He also critiqued the devolutionary perspective, which assumes that folklore runs down as societies modernize, arguing instead that folklore continuously adapts to contemporary life. Alan Dundes' work challenges the idea that folklore is merely a relic of the past. Folklore remains a vital cultural force, even as some traditions face scrutiny in modern societies. Consider European St. Nicholas processions, such as Krampus, Santa Claus, Class and class own. Media and political discourse increasingly critique these traditions for their perceived outdated elements. Journalists and policymakers often argue that such folklore practices have no place in modern society. However, Dundes reminds us that these critiques are themselves folk ideas, cultural assumptions emerging from within folklore. Folklore is not a fixed artifact but a living process that reflects and negotiates cultural identity. While some exclusive or controversial folkloric festivals face criticism, one figure continues to thrive: Santa Claus. The blending of folklore elements for commercial purposes has transformed Santa into what folklore scholar Michael Dillon Foster calls a folkloresque product, a commercialized phenomenon designed to appear traditional. The folkloresque concept is relevant in today's media-driven culture, where commercial forces shape folklore. Santa Claus, though derived from Sinterklaas and Father Christmas, has become a dominant global Christmas symbol. His evolution exemplifies bricolage, the commercial reassembly of folkloric elements into a culturally embedded tradition. Cultural scholar Paulo Prato describes Santa Claus as a symbol of the globalized imaginary, uniting people through a shared festive experience to establish a distinctly American holiday tradition. On a larger scale, Santa Claus embodies Francis Fukuyama's theory of historical directionality, where economic forces drive cultural homogenization. As societies secularize, commercialism adapts folklore to fit modern needs, crafting inclusive folkloric figures that align with multicultural values. While Santa Claus thrives as a commercially acceptable folkloric figure, exclusive and culturally specific traditions face increasing challenges. Media and government scrutiny often pressure traditional folklore to conform to contemporary norms, limiting cultural self-determination. Instead of accepting commercial globalism as the only model for folklore, we might advocate for the right to opacity, a concept introduced by Edouard Glissant, emphasizing cultural autonomy without requiring full transparency. This challenges globalization's tendency to standardize folklore, asserting the importance of cultural diversity even when traditions remain exclusive. Similarly, Erica Irene Days warns that globalization amplifies, yet homogenizes cultural voices. Folklore communities face increasing pressure to adapt or disappear. Laura Jane Smith argues that a crucial aspect of heritage, including folklore, is control over cultural representation. Without it, communities struggle to maintain their sense of identity. Next time you think about folklore, remember, our societies are not separate from it. We exist within folklore.